In July 1943, as German Panther tanks finally rolled toward the Kursk salient after months of delay, over half broke down before firing a single shot. Not from enemy action, but from catastrophic mechanical failures. A German officer later wrote bitterly, "We waited week after week, promised victory by the new tanks. When the Panthers arrived, we saw more of them burning than fighting." This technological disaster was the result of Hitler's fatal decision to postpone Operation Citadel, waiting for wonder weapons that would doom rather than save Germany's last great offensive. The winter of 1943 had been Germany's nightmare. Stalingrad's surrender in February cost the Wehrmacht an entire army, swallowed by the frozen Volga. Field Marshal von Manstein's brilliant counterattack stabilized the front and recaptured Kharkov, but everyone knew this was temporary. The strategic reality was brutal. Both sides stood exhausted. The Soviets had surged westward after Stalingrad, briefly taking Kharkov before Manstein pushed them back. Now, in the spring mud of 1943, the front had congealed into stalemate. But this wasn't equilibrium. It was a loaded gun waiting for someone to pull the trigger. If you're interested in how wars are actually decided by logistics, math, and doctrine, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more in-depth World War analysis. Let's continue. For Hitler, doing nothing was politically impossible. Stalingrad had shattered German morale. The home front needed victory. The Wehrmacht needed to prove it could still win. Germany's allies needed reassurance the Third Reich wasn't sinking. Yet every option carried catastrophic risk. Germany's panzer divisions were shadows of their former strength. Infantry replacements were inadequate. The Luftwaffe was being bled white, defending German cities from Allied bombing. The pressure on Hitler intensified from all sides. His generals warned that Germany's window for offensive action was closing rapidly. The Soviets were recovering faster than anticipated, building strength with every passing week. But attacking with depleted forces invited another Stalingrad. Staying defensive meant surrendering the initiative permanently, watching as Soviet industrial might ground Germany down through attrition. Hitler found himself trapped in a gambler's paradox. He had to bet, but every bet looked like suicide. In this desperate landscape, Hitler saw the Kursk salient, and a massive Soviet bulge jutting into German lines, as both opportunity and trap. Strike it successfully, and Germany might regain the initiative. Fail, and the war in the East would be irretrievably lost. The question was not whether to attack, but when and with what. The answer, Hitler believed, lay in Germany's factories. New tanks were rolling off production lines. Panthers with sloped armor that could deflect Soviet shells. Tigers whose 88mm guns could destroy enemy tanks at ranges previously unimaginable. Hitler postponed Operation Citadel repeatedly from May into July, explicitly to await these mechanical marvels. By July, Germany had approximately 200 Panthers and 146 Tigers available for Kursk. The logic seemed seductive. Why risk everything with yesterday's equipment when tomorrow's weapons were almost ready? But inside the conference rooms where Germany's fate was debated, the wonder weapon faith wasn't universal. Armaments Minister Albert Speer, the man who actually knew these tanks' production realities, explicitly told Hitler the Panthers were unready. Technical problems would be severe. The tanks needed more testing, the crews needed more training, the maintenance systems weren't ready. This wasn't pessimism, it was engineering reality. Speer was describing machines that looked revolutionary in the factory but hadn't proven themselves beyond the test track. But Hitler's mind was already made up. In the planning meetings, one voice rose above others in skepticism. General Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, the man who had pioneered Blitzkrieg, looked at the postponement plans and saw disaster. His assessment was blunt and prophetic. The Russians have had time to prepare and reinforce their defenses. We should not attack. This wasn't the caution of a timid bureaucrat. This was the architect of Germany's greatest victories, warning that the very delay meant to ensure triumph was guaranteeing defeat. Guderian understood what Hitler did not. Every week spent waiting for Panthers and Tigers gave the Soviets another week to dig trenches, lay mines, and position artillery. The technological advantage Hitler coveted was being buried under Soviet concrete and earth before a single shot was fired. Field Marshal von Manstein advocated for an earlier limited offensive, fearing Soviet preparations would negate any technological advantage. General Model echoed these concerns, a warning that the window of opportunity was closing with each passing day. But Hitler vacillated, caught between technological hope and strategic doubt. He declared, "I have decided to postpone the attack until the new tanks arrive," while privately expressing doubts about whether even these would suffice. This wasn't decisive leadership. It was paralysis dressed up as patience. So he chose to wait, and wait, and wait. While Hitler waited for his wonder weapons, Soviet intelligence achieved a coup of historic proportions. Through spy networks like the Lucy Ring in Switzerland, through intercepted German radio traffic, and through agents embedded in German command, Stalin and Marshal Georgy Zhukov knew almost everything about Operation Citadel. The timing, the direction, the exact composition of German forces, and even the arrival schedules for the new Panthers and Tigers. Every postponement Hitler announced, every delay for tank deliveries, the Soviets knew about it within days. A German staff officer would finalize plans in Berlin on Monday. By Wednesday, those plans were on Zhukov's desk in Moscow. By Friday, Soviet engineers were adjusting their defensive positions to counter exact German approach routes. What made this intelligence windfall truly catastrophic for Germany was how the Soviets used it. Zhukov transformed raw intelligence into strategic advantage. He knew exactly how much time he had. He knew exactly where to concentrate his forces. Armed with this intelligence and blessed with time, the Soviets began constructing something unprecedented in military history. A defensive system so elaborate, so deeply layered, and that it would transform the Kursk salient from a vulnerable bulge into an impregnable fortress. Every day Hitler delayed was another day Soviet soldiers dug. They excavated trenches and multiple defensive belts, stretching back dozens of kilometers. They laid over 400,000 mines. They positioned thousands of anti-tank guns with interlocking fields of fire. Over 1.3 million men transformed the Kursk salient into a fortress. They deployed 3,600 tanks and 2,400 aircraft. But the real advantage wasn't in mobile forces. It was in what they built. Multiple defensive belts, each several kilometers deep, layered with interconnected trenches, bunkers, and artillery positions. Anti-tank ditches stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Engineers constructed dummy positions to draw German fire, while actual defensive positions remained concealed until the moment of attack. Marshal Zhukov watched his confidence grow with each week of German delay. Soviet artillery commanders positioned their guns in carefully prepared firing positions with pre-calculated ranges to likely German approach routes. They stockpiled over 4 million artillery shells. One artillery commander told his men, "The Germans wait for their miracle machines. We trust in our trenches and our guns." Another wrote, "Every day they delay is another day we dig. Let them wait for their Panthers. We are building something they cannot break." By early July, when Hitler finally gave the order to attack, the Kursk salient had been transformed. What German intelligence had assessed months earlier as a vulnerable position was now a killing ground designed specifically to destroy the offensive Hitler had spent so long preparing. When the 1st Panther battalions reached the front lines in late June, the crews who had been promised invincible new weapons found themselves inheriting mechanical nightmares. Engines caught fire spontaneously. Transmissions seized after just kilometers of movement. Tracks broke under the tank's own weight. Over 50% of the approximately 200 Panthers were non-operational at Citadel's start, not from enemy action, but from engineering defects that should have been caught in testing. The mechanical failures followed predictable patterns that Speer had explicitly warned about. Engine fires erupted from overheating systems pushed into combat before proper testing. Transmissions inadequately designed for the Panther's 45-ton weight seized under the stress of cross-country movement. Track links snapped during movement, leaving crews stranded and vulnerable. Within days of combat, operational rates plummeted below 20% as breakdowns outpaced combat losses. Behind the statistics lay a logistical catastrophe. Spare parts for these new tanks were critically short. Maintenance crews trained on older models faced systems they barely understood. Disabled Panthers were cannibalized for parts to keep others running. Many tanks were simply abandoned, their crews retreating on foot from vehicles that had promised invincibility. The Tigers, while more reliable, were so heavy they broke through bridges and consumed fuel at rates that strained already overstretched supply lines. The Ferdinand tank destroyers proved fatally flawed in a different way. These 70-ton behemoths destroyed many Soviet tanks with their powerful 88mm guns. But German designers had made a catastrophic oversight. They lacked machine guns for close defense. When Soviet infantry closed in, and they always closed in, the Ferdinands became expensive coffins. At dawn on July 5, 1943, the German artillery barrage began. Operation Citadel was underway. The wonder weapons Hitler had waited for rolled forward into the most elaborate defensive system ever constructed. Germany deployed approximately 50 divisions attacking from two directions, spearheaded by the Panthers and Tigers that had justified 3 months of delay. Within hours, they encountered what those months had cost them. The Soviets had used the gift of time with devastating efficiency. Multiple defensive belts stretched back dozens of kilometers. The 400,000 mines laid during the delay channeled German armor into killing zones where concentrated artillery waited. Prepared positions allowed Soviet anti-tank guns to engage at optimal ranges. Soviet gunners had spent weeks training on mock-ups, learning exactly where to aim at a Panther to penetrate its armor. The numbers from Operation Citadel tell the story with brutal clarity. In 2 weeks of combat, Germany lost between 50,000 and 60,000 men. Over 300 tanks were destroyed or disabled. More than 200 aircraft were shot down. These weren't just statistics. They represented the Wehrmacht's last concentrated striking power on the Eastern Front. Each casualty was a trained soldier Germany couldn't replace. Each destroyed tank included experienced crews who couldn't be recreated in factories. The Soviets, despite suffering higher numerical losses of 177,000 to 254,000 casualties, possessed something Germany had lost: the industrial capacity and strategic reserves to absorb such punishment and come back stronger. Within weeks of Kursk's conclusion, Soviet factories had replaced the lost tanks. Within months, new conscripts filled the ranks. Germany emerged permanently weaker. The strategic initiative passed to the Soviets and would never return. The psychological impact cut deeper than material losses. German troops who had been promised technological salvation experienced a sharp decline in confidence no propaganda could reverse. Soviet confidence soared. The Red Army that had anxiously dug trenches during the delay now stood victorious. That psychological shift would prove as decisive as any material advantage. Guderian's prophecy that the Russians would have time to prepare and the attack would bring no decisive success had proved tragically accurate. Manstein's fear that Soviet preparations would negate technological advantages had been realized. The wonder weapons Hitler waited for arrived not as instruments of victory, but as symbols of misplaced faith. Their mechanical failures reflected the deeper, strategic bankruptcy of the entire operation. After Kursk, Germany would never again mass sufficient forces for a strategic offensive. The delay had cost Germany something more precious than tanks or soldiers. It had cost the Wehrmacht its last chance to shape the war's outcome in the East. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.